Before we begin tonight, a quick but genuine thank you to John Penvose for sending in this story idea. It is one of those topics that sat in the back of my mind from the moment I read the suggestion, and I knew we had to cover it in the way it deserves. If you have a story you want to see explored on this channel, a conspiracy, a mystery, a historical deep dive, something that has kept you up more than once, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and some of the best episodes on this channel have come directly from you. That is not something I say lightly, it is something I mean completely. Also, if you're listening on Spotify right now, please take 10 seconds and leave a review. It costs you nothing. It takes less time than brewing a cup of tea, and it helps this channel grow more than almost anything else you could do. Okay, now let us go somewhere dark together. Let us go to Seattle. There is a greenhouse above a garage on Lake Washington, Boulevard East in Seattle, Washington, and inside that greenhouse, on the morning of April 8th, 1994, an electrician climbed a short staircase expecting to check wiring for a newly installed security system. He was there for a routine job. He had done hundreds of routine jobs. He was not expecting anything other than the ordinary mechanical business of running cables and testing circuits. What he found instead changed the course of music history, and opened a wound in the culture of the 1990s that has never fully healed. The body of Kurt Cobain, 27 years old, lead vocalist and guitarist and primary songwriter of the band Nirvana, lay inside that room. A shotgun was found near him. A note had been left, written in red ink, addressed to an imaginary childhood friend. Within hours, the news had spread across every radio station, every television network, every morning newspaper in the world. The official ruling from the Seattle Police Department came with what seemed like clarity: suicide. And for most of the world, that ruling closed the door on the story of one of the most important musicians of the 20th century. It gave the grief a shape. It gave the incomprehensible a word, and for most people, the word was sufficient. But for a small and quietly determined number of investigators, journalists, retired industry insiders, and careful observers of the evidence, that ruling did not close anything at all. It only made the questions louder. This is the story of the missing days, the vanished tape, the contested note, the disputed toxicology, and the question that has survived 30 years of official reaffirmation and public scrutiny, and still refuses to lie quiet. Who was Kurt Cobain in the final weeks of his life? And what was he preparing to say to the world? Part 1. The making of a reluctant icon. To understand the conspiracy, you first have to understand the man. And to understand the man, you have to go back to the beginning, to a place that most people outside the Pacific Northwest have never visited and many have never heard of. Aberdeen, Washington sits approximately 100 miles southwest of Seattle, positioned between the Chehalis River and the raw, rain-soaked coast of the Pacific Ocean. It is the kind of town that accumulates in a person. The grey sky, the timber industry's boom and bust rhythm, the particular brand of working-class isolation that comes from being geographically remote and economically precarious. All of it presses into the people who grow up there in ways that do not always announce themselves immediately, but eventually become impossible to ignore. Kurt Cobain was born on February 20th, 1967, to Donald and Wendy Cobain. His father worked variously in automotive and service industry jobs. His mother worked in service and retail. The family was not wealthy, but they were not destitute in those early years, and by most accounts from people who knew him then, the young Kurt Cobain was a bright and strikingly sensitive child. He drew constantly, filling notebooks and loose sheets of paper with characters and creatures and scenes from his imagination. He sang around the house unprompted. He was the kind of child who notices everything: the temperature of a room, the tension in a voice, the thing that is not being said, and who carries that noticing in a way that can look, to other people, like intensity or strangeness, but is simply the experience of being highly attuned in a world that is not always kind to highly attuned people. His family described him as happy in the way that only very young children can be, completely, without reservation, without the protective distance that experience teaches. Then his parents' marriage ended. Cobain was 9 years old when Donald and Wendy Cobain divorced, and those who knew him then described the change in him as immediate and visible. He withdrew. He became quieter in ways that were different from natural childhood shyness. He began spending large amounts of time alone, retreating into music and art and the interior world that would later become the source of everything his public life produced. He moved between relatives, living for periods with his father, then his mother, then with his uncle, then with a series of friends and near strangers whose floors and couches and spare rooms became the shifting geography of his adolescence in Aberdeen. He would speak about the divorce in interviews throughout his adult life with a rawness that suggested it had never become entirely historical for him. He told one journalist that he had felt hated from that point forward, though he was careful to add that this might have been an exaggeration of a child's emotional logic. He told another that the divorce had taught him, at 9 years old, that love was not reliable, that the people closest to you could simply decide to stop, and that the safest response to that knowledge was to stop needing things from people before they stopped giving them. He began playing guitar seriously in his early teens. His mother bought him his first guitar when he was 14. By the time he was in his late teens, moving between Aberdeen and nearby Olympia, and spending significant time in the orbit of Seattle's developing underground music community, the guitar was not a hobby or a pastime or even an ambition. It was the only language he trusted to say what he actually meant. It was, he would say more than once, the only thing that had never let him down. He met Chris Novoselic, a tall and loose-limbed Croatian-American kid from Aberdeen, in the mid-1980s, and the two of them began playing together in a series of bands that cycled through names and drummers and small venues and basement parties with the energy of people who have found something real and do not yet know what to do with it. By 1988 they had settled into something that felt different from what had come before, something with more gravity to it, something that had found the particular channel between pop melody and destructive noise that would define the decade's most important musical transition. They called it Nirvana. Part 2, Nevermind and the Weight of the World. In September of 1991, Nirvana released their second album, Nevermind, on DGC Records. And what happened over the following months is one of the most extraordinary commercial and cultural explosions in the history of recorded music. The album had been projected to sell perhaps 250,000 copies, a solid performance for a band transitioning from indie to major label distribution. Not a blockbuster, not a cultural event, just a good record doing well. It sold 300,000 copies in its first week. By January of 1992, Nevermind had displaced Michael Jackson's Dangerous from the number 1 position on the Billboard 200. Smells Like Teen Spirit, the album's opening single, had become inescapable. It was playing in shopping malls. It was appearing in the background of television programs that were trying to signal they understood what young people cared about. It was being referenced in newspaper columns by critics who had dismissed guitar rock as a declining form. The song had begun as Cobain's somewhat self-conscious attempt to write a simple, radio-accessible punk pop song. He had described wanting to write the ultimate pop song, something consciously catchy in the tradition of the Pixies and the Vaselines, and it had instead become the anthem of an entire generation of young people who had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for music that understood their particular brand of exhaustion and alienation and frustration and longing. The album would eventually sell more than 30 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling records in the history of the format. Nirvana became the biggest band on earth with a speed and a thoroughness that left very little room for adjustment. And Kurt Cobain, who had spent most of his childhood sleeping on other people's floors and dreaming of a way out of Aberdeen, found himself standing at the centre of a cultural and commercial machine of staggering proportions, and discovering, with something approaching horror, that he did not know how to live inside it. The fame was not abstract. It was physical and relentless and present at every moment of his life, in ways that had no precedent in his experience. Photographers followed him to grocery stores. Journalists analysed his lyrics in academic publications and music magazines simultaneously. His marriage to Courtney Love in February of 1992 was covered as a celebrity event, dissected for what it supposedly revealed about his psychology and his choices and his character. Their daughter Frances Bean was born in August of That year and her birth was immediately a matter of public interest in ways that Cobain found deeply disturbing. He had been suffering from a chronic and painful stomach condition, a burning, cramping abdominal pain that had gone undiagnosed for years despite numerous medical consultations, and the stress of sudden, total, unavoidable fame made it worse. He had found, by some point in this period, that heroin provided relief, not just from the physical pain, though he described it that way in interviews and in his journals, from the noise of everything, from the relentless demand of being the person that millions of strangers had decided to need. Heroin quieted it, and the quiet, however temporary, however dangerous, was something he had been chasing for a long time. The machine did not care about any of this. The machine wanted more. The record label wanted the next album. The press wanted the next interview, the next controversy, the next angle on the story of the reluctant rock star who had accidentally become the voice of a generation. The stadiums around the world that Nirvana now filled wanted the performance of that contradiction, the anger and the tenderness, the noise and the melody, to be delivered on schedule and repeated indefinitely. Cobain gave interviews in which he said he was embarrassed to be in a successful rock band. He wore dresses on stage. He dedicated songs sarcastically to sponsors and to the corporate structure of the industry surrounding him. He seemed to be doing everything possible to make himself less famous, to disrupt the image, to introduce noise into the signal. Every disruption was absorbed by the machine and repackaged as part of the appeal. He could not make himself less famous. He could not make the world stop watching. And the tension between the raw and private and genuinely fragile person he actually was, and the global icon the world had decided he must be, was tearing him apart with a slowness and completeness that the people closest to him watched with increasing dread. Part 3. The Last Months. By the end of 1993 and into the early weeks of 1994, the people who knew Cobain best describe a man in serious accelerating crisis. The In Utero album, released in September of 1993, had been a deliberate artistic attempt to move away from the accessible production of Nevermind towards something rawer, more abrasive, more honest about the chaos underneath. Cobain had worked with producer Steve Albini specifically because Albini's approach to recording, live, minimal, unprocessed, felt more aligned with what Cobain actually wanted to say than the polished, arena-ready sound of Butch Vig's work on Nevermind. He had wanted In Utero to be difficult. He had wanted it to shed the casual listeners who had come to Nirvana through the radio and leave only the people who were genuinely interested in what the band was doing artistically. The album was still a massive commercial success. It still reached #1 in multiple countries because by that point the Nirvana name had become a gravitational force that outpaced any individual artistic decision. The machine did not care that Cobain had tried to make something alienating. The machine sold it anyway. The Unplugged in New York performance, recorded for MTV in November of 1993, is one of the most discussed and most carefully examined artifacts of his final period. The setlist leaned heavily on quieter material and covers, songs by the Meat Puppets, by David Bowie, by Lead Belly. The band played with candles and lilies arranged around them like a memorial, which at the time seemed like a piece of theatrical art direction, and in retrospect seems like something else entirely. His performance of Where Did You Sleep Last Night, the traditional folk song most famously associated with Lead Belly, is one of those rare moments in recorded music where you can hear someone operating at the absolute outer edge of what they can emotionally sustain. He holds the final note of the song longer than seems physically possible, and when the note ends and he opens his eyes, the expression on his face is one of total exhaustion. The audience was silent for a long moment before the applause began. Members of his inner circle later said they had known, watching that performance, that something fundamental was failing. In early 1994, Nirvana embarked on a European tour. Cobain struggled with his health throughout. His stomach condition had not resolved. His heroin use had escalated. In Rome on March 4th, he was found unresponsive in his hotel room at the Excelsior. The public statement at the time described the event as an accidental overdose of prescription drugs combined with alcohol. Those close to him were not so certain about the accidental part. He had, according to people present in Rome, been in a particularly dark state in the days preceding the incident. He recovered. He was flown back to Seattle to recuperate. When the band reconvened, the decision was made to stage an intervention. On March 25th, a group that included bandmates, close friends, family members, and representatives from his management and record label gathered at the family home. People described the event as painful, fragmented, emotionally exhausting for everyone present. Cobain agreed, eventually, to enter treatment. He was flown to the Exodus Recovery Center in Los Angeles. He arrived and checked in on March 30th, 1994. On April 1st, he climbed over the facility's fence and was gone. Part 4. The Missing Days. This is where everything becomes strange. This is the part of the story that should be straightforward and is not. Kurt Cobain disappeared from the Exodus Recovery Center on the morning of April 1st, 1994. And for the next 7 days he was physically missing. Not metaphorically. Not privately. Missing in the sense that none of the people responsible for him, his family, his management team, the private investigators hired specifically to locate him, could determine where he was. His whereabouts were unknown to everyone who was looking for him, and multiple people were looking for him with urgency. Courtney Love hired private investigator Tom Grant on April 3rd, 48 hours after the disappearance. Grant was a former Los Angeles County Sheriff's detective who had transitioned to private investigation work, and he took the case with the methodical approach of someone accustomed to finding people who did not want to be found. He began working through the available leads immediately. He contacted hospitals, checked hotel registries, reached out to friends and acquaintances, attempted to trace credit card activity and phone records. There were sightings, a handful of them, scattered, unverified, the kind of sightings that emerge whenever a famous missing person activates the human tendency to pattern match faces against the images circulating in the media. Someone thought they had seen him near the Seattle airport. Someone else believed they had spotted him in the Capitol Hill neighborhood where he had spent time during his years in the Seattle music community. One person said he had been seen entering a building connected to the music business. Grant documented these sightings in his notes. He pursued what leads he could, but none of the sightings were ever confirmed, and what struck Grant, and would continue to strike him in the years following the investigation, was that several of the reported sightings he gathered were never incorporated into any official account of the missing days. They were simply not there. The official timeline had gaps where the sightings suggested there might have been something to investigate. Whether that was a matter of investigative prioritization or something more, troubling has never been established. The discovery on April 8th came through the electrician's routine appointment. He arrived at the property on Lake Washington Boulevard East to complete the security system installation that had been scheduled days earlier. He climbed the stairs to the greenhouse above the garage. He saw a body through the glass. He called emergency services at 8:20 in the morning. When police arrived, they found Cobain lying on the floor. The shotgun was nearby. The note was nearby. The toxicology results would come later. The medical examiner estimated, based on the condition of the body and the temperature and other forensic indicators, that Cobain had been dead for approximately 2 to 3 days, which meant the death had most likely occurred sometime on or around April 5th. He had been lying there, in that greenhouse, undiscovered, for the better part of 3 days. Nobody had come to check. Nobody had been watching the house. The electricians. Routine appointment was the thing that ended the disappearance, and it ended it in the worst possible way. Part 5. The tape. Here is where the story takes the turn that most mainstream accounts of Kurt Cobain's death decline to spend much time examining. In the years following April of 1994, a retired sound engineer who had worked extensively in Seattle's independent and alternative music scene during the late 1980s and early 90s gave an account to journalist and independent researcher Daniel Mercer that introduced a detail which, once you know it, does not easily leave the mind. The engineer spoke to Mercer on the condition that his identity not be published. His account has never been independently verified in the sense of having been confirmed by a second witness to the same events. What can be verified, what Mercer says he verified personally, is only one part of the account. the existence of a session log at the studio in question for a night approximately 2 weeks before Cobain's death, showing a booking in Cobain's name or associated with him. The session log existed. The tape from that session did not. According to the engineer, Cobain arrived at the studio late at night, alone. He did not bring bandmates. He did not bring a producer. He did not bring anyone. He came alone, and he came with a specific, articulated purpose. He was not there to record music, the engineer told Mercer. He wanted to record a message, something personal, something long. The engineer recalled that Cobain had described what he wanted to do in terms of getting things off his chest. The session was run as a standard recording session in terms of the technical setup: a microphone, a recording booth, the normal apparatus of a studio environment, but the content was entirely verbal. Cobain was in the booth for what the engineer estimated to be several hours. The engineer was not monitoring the content of what was being recorded in real time. He was managing the technical side of the session, ensuring the levels were right, keeping the equipment running, doing what engineers do. He did not know what Cobain was saying. He did not ask. When the session ended and Cobain was ready to leave, the engineer said the departure was relatively quick. Cobain seemed, by the engineer's account, calmer than he had appeared when he arrived. Whether that calm was relief or exhaustion or something else, the engineer could not say. Cobain left. The engineer locked up the studio. The tape was still in the machine when he left for the night. He assumed Cobain would return for it, or that someone would collect it on his behalf. He did not give it more thought for a significant period. When Mercer investigated the studio years later, he found the session log. That much was verifiable. But the tape was absent from the studio archives. No record existed of when it had been removed. No record existed of who had removed it. No inventory. Note, no checkout log. No indication of whether the tape had been claimed by Cobain, his estate, his management, his label, or anyone else. It had been there, and then it had not been there, and the space between those two conditions was entirely undocumented. The engineer, when Mercer returned to him with this information, confirmed again with clarity that Cobain had not taken the tape when he left the studio that night. The tape was in the machine. The engineer had seen it there. He locked the studio and the tape was inside. Beyond that, he could not account for it. Mercer spent years pursuing the question of where the tape had gone. He contacted former studio employees. He reached out through industry channels to people who had worked adjacent to Cobain's professional orbit during that period. He submitted records requests. He followed leads that dissolved into dead ends. Nothing. The tape, if it had ever existed, had been removed from the record as completely as if it had never been there. And what Cobain might have said in those hours, what he had needed to get off his chest in a private studio session in the last 2 weeks of his life, remains, as of this recording, entirely unknown. Part 6. The Industry Machine. By early 1994, Nirvana had generated revenues measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Their back catalogue, their touring operation, their merchandise empire, their licensing agreements. All of it represented an economic infrastructure that sustained not just the band itself, but layers of management, label staff, legal professionals, merchandising companies, booking agents, promoters, and ancillary businesses whose livelihoods depended in whole or in part on the continued commercial functioning of the Nirvana enterprise. And Kurt Cobain was, in those final months, growing increasingly and openly hostile to it. This is not speculation, or interpretive license applied after the fact. It is documented across his interviews, his journals, his letters to friends, and the accounts of nearly everyone who spent meaningful time with him during his last year of life. He resented the way the music industry worked. He resented the way that genuine artistic expression was identified, packaged, commercially distributed, and systematically drained of the meaning that had made it real in the first place. He resented what he understood as the exploitation built into the standard model of label-artist relationships, the contractual structures that gave labels enormous control over artists' work, the accounting practices that could produce situations where enormously successful musicians ended up with far less money than the scale of their commercial impact would suggest. He had spoken in interviews about wanting to renegotiate his relationship to fame and to the industry structures surrounding him. He had told friends that he felt trapped in a way that had nothing to do with heroin and everything to do with the institutional commitments that made it essentially impossible to simply stop. Some people who spent time with him in those months described conversations about a future that looked radically different from his present, making music in small rooms for people who genuinely cared about it, without stadium tours and without the machinery of commercial promotion, and without the feeling of being a product managed by people whose primary interest was extracting value from him. Others describe him talking about speaking out more directly and more specifically about the way the industry treated the people who actually created the content it sold. Given what we know now, and what was knowable then by anyone who had spent time close to the mechanisms of the major label system, Cobain's anger was not irrational or unfounded. The contracts signed by developing artists in the 1980s and early 90s were frequently structured in ways that would be considered exploitative by any objective standard. Advances that required recoupment from artist royalties before the artist saw $1 of their sales percentage, merchandise deals structured to give labels or management a majority cut of revenue the artist had generated purely through the power of their own name and image, recording contract options that gave labels the right to bind an artist to multiple additional albums on terms that could not be renegotiated, regardless of how the artist's commercial power had grown in the intervening time. Cobain had experienced all of this firsthand. He was one of the most commercially successful artists in the world, and he was also, by multiple accounts, someone who felt genuinely and materially constrained by the structures that surrounded his success. If he had decided to use the global platform that Nirvana's success had given him to speak about these things specifically, naming practices, naming terms, describing in detail the mechanisms by which artists were controlled and the ways those controls operated to the benefit of industry entities at the expense of creative workers, the financial and reputational stakes for the people and institutions he might have named would have been enormous. This is the context that gives the missing tape its most troubling possible dimension. Not a certainty of foul play, not an accusation, but a context in which the stakes of what might have been said were genuinely high enough to create motivation for those who would have had reason to prefer the tape not exist. Part 7. Tom Grant and the record that would not close. Tom Grant entered the picture as a professional private investigator hired to find a missing person, and he left it as one of the most persistent and controversial voices in 3 decades of public debate about the most scrutinized death in the history of rock music. Grant had spent years in law enforcement before transitioning to private work. He was methodical by training and by temperament. When he was hired on April 3rd, 1994, he approached the search the way he had been trained to approach any missing person case, systematically, with attention to inconsistencies and anomalies, building a timeline from verified facts and treating unverified information as unverified until it could be confirmed. What he found over the course of his investigation during those final days, and what he continued to find in the years of review that followed, was a case that contained enough genuine inconsistency to make a professional in his field deeply uncomfortable with a rapid conclusion. He documented everything. He kept audio recordings of phone conversations with relevant parties during the period of the active investigation. He maintained detailed written notes. He preserved the records of his investigation in a form that he eventually made publicly available, and those records became a primary source for anyone who wanted to engage seriously with the questions the case raised without being forced to rely on secondary accounts of what Grant had found. Over the years following April of 1994, Grant gave hundreds of interviews. He was consistent on certain core points. He believed the investigation had moved too quickly. He believed there were questions about the timeline that had not been adequately addressed. He believed there were aspects of the physical evidence that merited more scrutiny than they had received. He stopped short of naming any specific person as responsible for any specific alternative explanation. His position was, at its most precise, that the case deserved to be treated as an open investigation rather than a closed one, and that the institutional pressure to reach a rapid conclusion had resulted in a ruling that was not sufficiently supported by the thoroughness of the investigation that preceded it. The Seattle Police Department reviewed the case multiple times over the following decades and reaffirmed the ruling of suicide on each occasion. In 2024, 30 years after the death, the department released a collection of photographs from the scene that had been held in evidence since April of 1994. The release came in response to a public records request and generated significant media coverage. Some observers felt the images confirmed the official conclusion. Others focused on details they found ambiguous or inconsistent with their understanding of the evidence. The department's position did not change. But Grant's notes, the real-time documentation of a professional investigator, conducting an active investigation in the days immediately surrounding the death, remained what they had always been. A contemporaneous record of questions that were never fully answered. Part 8. The Note. The note Kurt Cobain left deserves its own extended and careful examination, because it is one of the most analysed documents in the entire history of popular music, and 30 years of analysis have not produced anything approaching consensus about what it means. The note was written in red ink on several pages, addressed to Bodder, the imaginary childhood friend Cobain had invented when he was very young, a detail so specifically personal that it functions on one level as a kind of authentication. It runs several paragraphs of substantial length. When you read it carefully and without the frame of the official ruling already shaping your interpretation, what strikes many people immediately is that the bulk of the note does not read as a conventional farewell to life. It reads as a farewell to a career, to a public identity, to the specific machinery of commercial fame that had come to feel unbearable. Cobain writes about losing the passion and sense of excitement that music had given him since childhood, a loss he describes as one of the most devastating experiences of his adult life. He writes about watching his audience feel the music with an intensity he can no longer access himself, and about the guilt he feels for that disconnection. He writes about being too sensitive, too empathetic, constitutionally unsuited to the public demands of the life his success had created for him. He writes about his daughter Frances with a tenderness that is unlike anything else in the document, referring to her in terms that suggest he considers her the best thing in his world. He refers to his wife. He references what he describes as the punk rock ethic that formed his artistic foundation, and the impossibility of living up to it while simultaneously being the face of a global commercial enterprise. The explicit turn toward death, the direct and unambiguous language of suicide, appears in the final section of the note. This transition from a document that reads like a resignation letter from public life to a document that describes leaving life itself has attracted enormous attention over the years. Handwriting analysis conducted by multiple independent experts in the decades following the death has produced contested results. Some analysts have noted that the handwriting in the final section of the note appears to show measurable variation from the handwriting in the earlier sections. Variation in letter formation, pen pressure, and spatial arrangement that suggests to some the involvement of a different writer or a significantly different psychological state in the writing of the final lines compared to the rest of the document. Other analysts have argued that the variation falls within the range of normal variation observable when a single writer produces a long document under conditions of extreme emotional stress. The official investigation did not find the handwriting variation sufficient to alter the conclusion. The note was treated as genuine and complete. But the question of whether the final lines of that note say what they say, because Kurt Cobain wrote them in the state of mind in which the investigation believes he wrote them, is a question that remains, in any rigorously honest assessment, unresolved. Part 9. The Toxicology and the Debate That Will Not End. One of the most persistent and most technically complex arguments in the ongoing discussion of Cobain's death involves the toxicological findings in the medical examiner's report. The report indicated a blood morphine level. Heroin metabolizes into morphine in the body, so this measurement is the standard way of quantifying heroin intake in post-mortem analysis of 1.52 milligrams per litre. The significance of this number has been debated continuously by medical professionals, forensic experts, and researchers for 3 decades, and the debate has never reached a conclusive resolution. The argument made by those who find the toxicological findings suspicious runs as follows. A blood morphine level of 1.52 milligrams per litre represents in most clinical assessments a very high dose of opiates, a dose, many experts have argued, that would have been severely incapacitating for most individuals and potentially fatal in itself, independent of any other cause of death. Opiates at high blood concentrations suppress the central nervous system in ways that progressively impair motor control, coordination, and conscious volitional activity. At sufficiently elevated levels, the argument goes, the ability to perform a complex, physically demanding coordinated action would be significantly compromised if not effectively impossible. The counter-argument, which the official investigation accepted, and which represents the mainstream forensic position, is that tolerance completely changes the equation. A person who's been using opiates regularly over a period of years develops a physiological tolerance that makes direct numerical comparison to the responses of occasional users or non-users clinically meaningless. The same blood level that would incapacitate or kill a person with no tolerance may produce relatively modest effects in a person with high tolerance. The official investigation and the medical examiner's assessment operated on the understanding that Cobain's tolerance was significant enough to account for the toxicological findings. The complicating factor, the wrinkle that keeps this debate alive, is that Cobain had, immediately prior to his death, completed at least a partial stay in a rehabilitation facility. Opiate rehabilitation involves managed withdrawal, and managed withdrawal has the effect of reducing or eliminating the physiological tolerance that regular use builds over time. A person who has been through even a brief period of detoxification will have meaningfully lower tolerance than they had before entering treatment. Whether the reduction in Cobain's tolerance from his days at Exodus was significant enough to materially affect the interpretation of the toxicological findings is a question that depends on details: how long he was actually in treatment before leaving, what substances he may have consumed in the days between his departure from Exodus and his death, the individual variability of his physiological response, that cannot be definitively established from the available record. The debate continues. It will not be resolved here. What it illustrates is the pattern that runs through every technical element of this case. The evidence is real, the measurements are documented, and the interpretations remain genuinely contested among people with relevant professional expertise. That contestation is not a conspiracy. It is the natural consequence of an investigation that moved to a conclusion before all of the questions had been answered, to the satisfaction of everyone qualified to evaluate them. Part 10. The world that lost him. Whatever conclusions you draw about the circumstances of his death, whatever position you take on the questions that have persisted for 30 years, what is not in dispute is the scale and the character of what the world lost on or around April 5th, 1994. The outpouring of grief that followed the discovery of his body on April 8th was unlike almost anything that had come before it in the cultural history of popular music. Thousands of people gathered in Seattle at the public vigil held at Seattle Center on April 10th. Courtney Love read portions of the note aloud. People wept openly, in public, for a man most of them had never met, in the way that people weep for family. Similar gatherings happened in cities across the United States and in countries where Nirvana had built their audience over the preceding 3 years. Radio stations played nothing but Nirvana records for hours at a stretch. MTV interrupted its regular programming repeatedly. The phones at suicide prevention hotlines lit up across the country in the days following the announcement as young people who felt personally connected to Cobain processed their grief in the most private and dangerous ways. The organization's counselors noted the spike with alarm. He had meant something to an entire generation, in a way that very few public figures ever managed to mean something, not as a distant celebrity whose existence you appreciated, but as a presence that understood you, that had reached through the noise of the world and found the specific frequency of your loneliness and your anger and your tenderness, and reflected it back in a form that you recognized as completely true. That is not a small thing. That is one of the rarest and most valuable things that art can do. It creates recognition. It makes the interior life of a private person feel visible and legitimate and shared. Cobain had done that for millions of people who had grown up feeling that their interior lives were invisible and illegitimate and entirely alone. And the loss of that recognition, the knowledge that the voice that had understood them would no longer produce anything new, is what made the grief of April 1994 feel less like the loss of a musician and more like the loss of something irreplaceable in the architecture of their emotional lives. Part 11. The fragments. Better sit with the fragments, because that is what this case ultimately is. Not a single smoking gun, not a leaked document that resolves the contradictions, not a confession, a deathbed statement, a revealed witness who was there and can tell us what actually happened. Just fragments. Accumulated fragments from 3 decades of investigation, journalism, and careful attention, none of them individually conclusive, all of them pointing toward a picture that has too many blank spaces to be fully seen. There is a session log at a recording studio in Seattle showing a booking in Cobain's name approximately 2 weeks before his death. There is no tape corresponding to that session. There are a handful of reported sightings of Cobain during the week between April 1st and April 8th that were never incorporated into the official timeline of his movements. There is a note whose handwriting shows variation that expert analysts have been unable to agree on for 30 years. There is a toxicology report whose interpretation depends on contested assumptions about tolerance and the effects of recent rehabilitation. There is a private investigator with 30 years of notes and audio recordings and carefully documented observations and no conclusive evidence of what he suspects. There is a missing week whose complete geography has never been established to anyone's full satisfaction. Fragments. The conspiracy tradition around Cobain's death is not, at its most intellectually serious, a claim that a specific named person definitely murdered him, and that the official investigation was a cover-up orchestrated by powerful interests. At its most intellectually serious, it is something more modest and more difficult to dismiss. It is an argument that the investigation moved too quickly, that the conclusion was reached before all of the questions had been answered, and that the institutional and commercial pressures surrounding the case created conditions in which thoroughness was sacrificed to speed. That argument, not the murder accusation, but the procedural critique, has survived 30 years of official review and public scrutiny. It has survived because the gaps it identifies have never been filled. The missing days are still missing, the tape is still gone, the note is still ambiguous, and the official record still contains the same blank spaces it contained in April of 1994. Part 12. The tape revisited returned to the tape one final time. Because the tape, if it existed, is the most tantalizing element of this entire story. It is the element that transforms the case from a set of procedural questions about an investigation into a human mystery of genuine depth. A man in the last 2 weeks of his life going alone to a recording studio in the middle of the night, spending hours recording something personal, something he needed to say, something he described as getting things off his chest. And then the tape is gone, if it still exists somewhere. If it was not destroyed but simply removed and stored and perhaps forgotten, then somewhere in the world there is a recording of Kurt Cobain speaking freely, privately, without the mediation of a journalist or a publicist or a camera crew or the awareness of an audience. Speaking the way he spoke only when he felt he was not being watched. The engineer described him as seeming calmer when he left than when he arrived. That detail, small as it is, suggests that the recording had done something for him. That the act of speaking privately, of putting words to whatever he had been carrying, had provided something like relief. We do not know what he said. We do not know if he was talking about the industry, about his private struggles, about his plans for the future, about his fears, about the people he loved. We do not know if the tape is evidence of anything beyond a man using the tools he trusted most. A microphone, a recording booth, the act of speaking into something that listened, to process an interior experience that had become too heavy to hold silently. The absence of the tape is not proof of anything. Absence proves nothing. Things are lost constantly in the ordinary course of the world's business without the involvement of any sinister intent. But in the context of everything else that is absent from the account of Kurt Cobain's final days, the missing week, the unlogged sightings, the unexplained removal of the tape from a studio archive, the absence is one more blank space in a picture that has too many of them. Part 13. What 30 years looks like. 30 years have passed since the morning of April 8th, 1994. 94. The world has processed Cobain's death through multiple cycles of cultural grief and reassessment and reappraisal. He has been the subject of major biographies, documentary films, museum retrospectives, academic scholarship, tribute concerts attended by hundreds of thousands of people, and more podcast episodes than anyone has bothered to count. His journals were collected and published. His letters were archived. The Unplugged in New York performance became one of the defining concert recordings in the history of the format. In 2014, Nirvana was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in their first year of eligibility, with Dave Grohl, Chris Novoselic, and Pat Smear performing at the ceremony alongside a group of celebrated women vocalists. Frances Bean Cobain grew up, became an artist and visual creative in her own right, and periodically engaged with the public legacy of her father's life and work with a thoughtfulness and self-possession that speaks to a kind of internal reckoning with the extraordinary weight of that inheritance. Chris Novoselic continued making music and pursued an interest in electoral reform and civic engagement. Dave Grohl built Foo Fighters into one of the most consistently successful rock bands of the generation that followed, and has spoken with evident care and emotional honesty about his experiences with Nirvana and what Cobain's death meant to him personally. The music endured. That is the most important thing. The music endured in the way that only genuine art endures, not because it was preserved institutionally, though it was, but because it continued to find new ears among people who had not been alive in April of 1994 and who encountered it the way every generation encounters the art that matters to it, as something that seemed to have been made specifically for the interior of their particular experience. The questions endured too. They endured because the human impulse to fully understand the death of someone who mattered does not expire on a schedule. We want a complete account. We want a narrative that does not leave days unaccounted for, tapes untraced, notes ambiguous, or toxicology contested. We want the story to make sense all the way to its end. When it does not, when official investigations move quickly to conclusions that leave open questions behind them, when records are incomplete and archives are missing materials and witness accounts are not incorporated, the mind does what it has always done. It fills the gaps. Not all gap-filling is equal. Some conspiracy theories are elaborate, internally contradictory constructions built from motivated reasoning and wishful thinking, and the need to believe that catastrophic losses always have someone responsible for them. But some are something else. Some are simply the refusal to accept that a person who mattered deserved less than a complete and honest accounting of what happened to them, and that refusal, however imperfect the theories it generates, is not an unreasonable thing. Part 14. The Engineer's Last Account. Daniel Mercer, in the final piece he published about his years of research into the case, describes one last conversation with the retired sound engineer. By this point the engineer was elderly, and his health was declining. He understood, Mercer wrote, that he might not have many more opportunities to discuss what he knew. His memory of specific details from 30 years earlier had softened and shifted in the way that all human memory does over time. He was uncertain about some of the specifics, the exact date, the precise length of the session, the details of what Cobain had looked like when he arrived compared to when he left. But on one point he was completely and consistently clear. He had not imagined the session. He had not constructed the memory from something else. Kurt Cobain had come to that studio alone late at night and had spent several hours recording something deeply personal, and when the engineer had locked up the studio at the end of that night, the tape was inside. He had not taken it. He had never claimed to know who had. He did not know if the tape had been destroyed. He did not know if it had been claimed by someone with a legitimate reason to have it. He did not know if it still existed somewhere, but he believed it did. He used the word waiting more than once in Mercer's account of their final conversation. He said the tape was waiting somewhere. He said the things Cobain had needed to say were on that tape, preserved in whatever condition 30 years of storage had left them. The engineer died in 2017. He never heard what was on the tape. Mercer published his account the following year, and the tape, if it exists, is still wherever it has been since the night or the day or the week when someone removed it from a recording studio in Seattle and carried it out of the public record into the silence that has held it ever since. Epilogue: the official record and the human record. The official record is clear. The Seattle Police Department ruled the death of Kurt Cobain a suicide. That ruling has been reviewed and reaffirmed on multiple occasions by the department and by independent forensic review. The medical evidence, as interpreted by the examining authorities, supports it. The legal process reached its conclusion, and the conclusion stands. In the absence of new evidence that would materially alter the basis for that ruling, it is where the official record will remain. But the official record and the human record are not always identical. They cover the same events, but they do not always cover them with the same completeness. The human record contains the missing days whose geography has never been fully established. It contains the session log without a tape. It contains the handwriting variation that expert analysts have disagreed about for 3 decades. It contains the toxicological findings that remain contested among professionals with relevant expertise. It contains 30 years of careful questions from people who loved the music and felt, in some way that was more instinctive than analytical, that the account they had been given was not complete. The human record does not prove a different conclusion. It carries the weight of everything that was never fully explained, and it will carry that weight for as long as people keep listening to the records, keep reading the note, keep returning to the questions, and keep believing that Kurt Cobain, the child from Aberdeen who found in music the only language honest enough to hold what he needed to say, deserved a complete and honest account of what happened to him in the final days of April 1994. Sleep well tonight. And if you find yourself awake at 3 in the morning with the silence sitting heavy around you, put on Nevermind or Unplugged or In Utero and listen. It will still sound, after all these years, like someone genuinely understood you. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Before we get into tonight's story, a quick thank you to Dogface680. If you have a story idea, a mystery, a conspiracy, something that keeps you up at night, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's talk about the Superstition Mountains and the curse that was never really a curse at all. There is a place in the American Southwest where the desert does not simply end. It rises, it erupts from the flat, sun-bleached earth in jagged volcanic formations, in sheer canyon walls of blackened rust and deep arterial red, in towers of ancient stone that lean over the land like judges passing sentence on anyone foolish enough to enter. The Superstition Mountains of central Arizona do not invite you. They tolerate you briefly, and then they take you. They have been taking people for a very long time. On the morning of March 14th, 2024, a search and rescue team from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office received a distress ping from a GPS locator device registered to a man named Gerald Ashmore, age 52, a prospector and amateur geologist from Tucson who had filed a solo exploration permit 3 days earlier. The ping placed him approximately 2.7 miles northeast of Weaver's Needle, the most iconic formation in the Superstition Wilderness, a volcanic spine of rock that rises like a broken tooth from the desert floor. By the time the helicopter reached the coordinates, there was no Gerald Ashmore. There was only silence, the creak of wind through canyon walls, and the long shadows that the mountains cast over the valley below, like something ancient pulling the light back into itself. Rangers located his camp the following morning. His tent was intact, his water supply almost untouched. His sleeping bag was unrolled but had not been slept in. His camp stove still held a half-full propane canister. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been disturbed. The only thing missing was Gerald Ashmore himself, and whatever he had seen in the mountains the night before. It would take search teams 11 more days to find his body, wedged into a narrow ravine on the eastern slope of a formation locals call the Flat Iron, a place where the topographic maps show nothing unusual, where there are no marked trails, where experienced hikers would have no reason to venture without a specific and deliberate destination in mind. The official cause of death was listed as exposure and dehydration, complicated by a fall. The case was closed within 48 hours of the body's recovery. What the official report did not mention, what it could not mention, because the documentation had already been removed from the evidence chain before the coroner's examination, was what the rangers found inside Gerald Ashmore's backpack. There were maps, hand-drawn on yellowed paper, in a style that matched cartographic techniques from the mid-20th century, showing a network of mine shafts and tunnels beneath the western face of the Superstitions. There was a magnifying loupe for mineral examination, still warm from his body heat when they recovered it. There was a field notebook filled with observations that referenced specific compass anomalies, unusual rock formations, and what he described as a metallic taste in the air that grew stronger the deeper he moved into a particular canyon system. And there was a Geiger counter, a modern digital model, not antique, not decorative, with a notation taped to its casing in Gerald Ashmore's handwriting. The radiation spikes at sunset. Do not stay after dark. The rangers photographed the contents. The photographs were logged. The physical items were transported to the evidence facility in Mesa. By the time a reporter filed a public records request for the incident documentation 2 weeks later, the photographs of the backpack contents had been removed from the file. The items themselves had been transferred to a federal agency, whose name on the transfer form was partially redacted. The form number corresponded to a designation used by the United States Department of Energy. The case of Gerald Ashmore officially was a simple tragedy. A man went into the desert alone. He got lost. He died. It happens in Arizona with the depressing regularity that the desert demands from those who underestimate it. But Gerald Ashmore was not a careless man. He had been entering the Superstitions for more than 20 years. He knew every trail. He knew the water sources, the weather patterns, the way the heat moved through the canyons in the late afternoon. He was not the kind of man who got lost. He was the kind of man who found things. And whatever he found in that canyon on the night of March 13th, 2024, was something that certain people in certain federal offices apparently could not allow to remain in the public record. This is where the story of the Superstition Mountains begins, not in some distant century of myth and legend, but here, now, in the age of GPS coordinates and digital evidence chains and federal transfer forms with redacted agency names. The curse of these mountains did not end when the frontier closed. It adapted. Long before any European prospector set foot in the Sonoran Desert, long before the Spanish colonial expeditions pushed north through the territory that would eventually become Arizona, the people who lived in and around what would become the Superstition Wilderness knew the mountains as something other than a geological feature. The Western Apache, who had maintained their relationship with this landscape for generations beyond the reach of written history, had specific and carefully maintained traditions about certain areas within the range. These were not generalized superstitions about mountain spirits or the dangers of the wilderness. They were precise, specific, locationally exact in ways that modern researchers have found genuinely difficult to explain. The Apache name for the mountains, loosely transliterated, carries within it a concept that early Anglo translators rendered as the place where the earth burns, not where fire has burned, not where the sun burns, where the earth itself burns, an ongoing internal process, something emanating from beneath the ground rather than descending from above. Warriors who entered certain drainages within the range reported physical symptoms that the Apache described through their own medical framework. A sensation of heat from the ground beneath their feet even in cool weather. A persistent metallic taste in the mouth that grew stronger with proximity to certain rock formations. Disorientation that struck suddenly and without warning, causing experienced trackers to lose their sense of direction. In terrain they had travelled dozens of times before. In more serious cases, a skin condition described as a burning rash that appeared without any external cause. These were not vague reports of spiritual unease. They were clinical observations, filtered through a cultural framework that interpreted them as evidence of something powerful and dangerous residing within the rock itself. The thunder gods, in Apache tradition, were beings of enormous and destructive power who lived within the mountains and expressed their displeasure at human intrusion through fire, through noise, through the kind of physical punishment that left a man broken and disoriented on the canyon floor. Apache war parties avoided certain approaches to the mountains entirely, not out of superstition in the modern dismissive sense of the word, but out of practical, experience-based caution. People who crossed into those specific zones came back wrong, or they did not come back at all. When you set this traditional knowledge alongside what we now understand about uranium geology, about the effects of ionizing radiation on the human body, about the way that certain geological formations in the American Southwest contain extraordinarily high concentrations of radioactive ore, a different picture emerges. The Apache were not wrong. They were accurate observers of real phenomena, describing through the only interpretive framework available to them what was, in fact, a genuine and measurable physical danger. The Earth in those specific locations does burn, in a sense. It emits energy. It disrupts compass needles through its magnetic and electromagnetic effects. It causes the metallic taste that comes from radiation affecting the saliva and mucous membranes. It produces the skin irritation that comes from direct contact with radioactive mineral dust. It disorients through a combination of physiological effects and magnetic field disruption that can compromise an experienced navigator's sense of direction within minutes of exposure. The thunder gods were the mountains themselves. The curse was geology, and the people who understood it best were the ones who were systematically pushed off the land and out of the conversation when the men with the picks and the promises arrived. In the winter of 1871, a man named Jacob Waltz walked into the office of a Phoenix land registry and filed a prospecting claim for mineral exploration rights in the eastern Maricopa County Territory, in the area around the Superstition Mountains. He was 53 years old, a German immigrant who had come to America in 1839 and spent the intervening decades working his way across the continent toward the Western Territories in the tradition of thousands of other men for whom the promise of mineral wealth in the American West represented the only viable path to economic security. He had worked claims in California and Nevada and New Mexico. He was not a lucky prospector by most accounts, and not a particularly successful one. But by the middle of the 1870s something had changed. He was spending money he did not appear to have legitimate income to support. He was paying for supplies in gold, not gold coin, but raw gold ore, nuggets and dust that assayers in Phoenix and Mesa examined with the kind of careful attention that genuine high-grade specimens always attracted. The gold was remarkable. Multiple assay records from the period, some of which survive in the Arizona State Archives, note that the ore Waltz brought in contained unusually pure vein gold, with a purity grade that put it among the highest quality specimens seen in the Arizona Territory. What the assay reports also noted in the dry technical language of the period that did not then have the interpretive framework to fully understand what it was observing was that the ore contained trace mineral inclusions of a type that geologists of the era associated with deep primary deposits, formations that had not been exposed to the surface weathering processes that degraded most accessible ore. The specific mineral trace that appears in multiple assay records from this period, described variously as a dark metallite inclusion, or a heavy metallic accessory mineral, was, based on the physical descriptions, almost certainly uraninite, the primary ore mineral of uranium, occurring naturally within the gold-bearing vein formation. Jacob Waltz knew exactly where his mine was. He returned to it multiple times over a period of more than 15 years, always alone, always on foot, always entering the mountains from a different direction to prevent anyone from tracking his route. He spoke about it with a handful of people over those years. Neighbours, a saloon keeper in Phoenix, a woman named Julia Thomas, who would become the central figure in the final chapter of his life. But he never provided usable directions to anyone. He described it in ways that were simultaneously detailed and impossible to follow. A mine entrance visible from a certain ridge only when the sun was in a specific position. A landmark stone formation that could only be seen from inside a particular canyon. A series of compass bearings taken from reference points that no one else could reliably identify. Whether this was deliberate obfuscation, or simply the imprecise recollection of a man who navigated primarily by deep familiarity with terrain rather than formal coordinates, is impossible to know. What is clear is that he took the precise location with him when he died. Jacob Waltz died on October 25, 1891, in the Phoenix home of Julia Thomas, an ice cream shop owner who had taken him in after he became too ill and too old to continue his desert prospecting alone. In his final days, feverish and intermittently delirious, he described his mind to her in fragments. The canyon, the needle-shaped rock formation that served as the primary landmark, the direction of the entrance, the depth of the vein. Julia Thomas spent years after his death searching for the mine, hiring guides, organising expeditions, eventually selling hand-drawn treasure maps to anyone who would buy them to recoup the enormous cost of her search efforts. She never found it. Hundreds of people who followed her maps never found it. But what strikes anyone who examines the historical record of Jacob Waltz's final years closely is not the mystery of the mine's location. It is the mystery of his death. He was, by the testimony of everyone who knew him in his final years, a man of extraordinary physical constitution. He had spent decades doing the most physically demanding labour the American frontier offered, in some of the most brutal desert terrain on the continent. He was tough. He was hardened. And then, beginning in the late 1880s, he began to decline with a speed and a specificity that the medical understanding of the era could not fully account for. He suffered from persistent weakness and fatigue. He developed sores on his skin that would not heal. He lost weight rapidly. His hair thinned. He experienced bouts of severe nausea and disorientation. The Phoenix physician who attended him in his final months documented these symptoms carefully but could find no clear diagnosis. The standard diseases of the era, tuberculosis, typhoid, various parasitic infections, did not match the clinical picture. He died of something that manifested like a systemic failure of every organ in his body simultaneously, a progressive and catastrophic breakdown of his physical health over a period of approximately 3 to 4 years. That is what acute radiation syndrome looks like when it develops slowly through long-term, repeated exposure rather than a single high-dose event. Chronic radiation poisoning from years of working in close contact with high-grade uranium ore, breathing the radon gas that naturally emanates from uranium formations, handling radioactive mineral specimens with bare hands, eating and drinking in proximity to radioactive dust, without any awareness of the danger. Jacob Waltz did not know what was killing him. No one in 1891 knew what uranium was capable of. Marie Curie would not publish her foundational research on radioactivity for another 7 years. The concept of ionizing radiation as a biological hazard was not part of anyone's intellectual framework. Waltz simply grew sick and died, and everyone around him attributed it to the accumulated toll of a hard life in a hard country. Nobody thought to look at the ore. The Peralta family's story is older than Jacob Waltz's, and it is written in blood. The legend, and the historical record supports at least the broad outlines of it, holds that a Mexican mining family named Peralta, or possibly a series of family-connected expeditions operating under the Peralta name, was mining gold in the Superstitions in the years before the American annexation of the Arizona Territory, which became official in 1848 following the Mexican-American War. The family allegedly operated multiple claims in the mountains, extracting significant quantities of gold ore and transporting it south to Mexico in periodic pack train expeditions. At some point in the mid-1840s, the exact date varies depending on the source, one of those expeditions was ambushed. The historical question is by whom? Apache warriors are the most commonly cited perpetrators, and the Apache were certainly active in the region and had every reason to resist the presence of foreign mining operations on territory they controlled. But some researchers, looking at the physical evidence recovered from the massacre site over the subsequent decades, the scattered mule bones, the fragmentary equipment, the occasional human remains, have noted details that suggest the confrontation was more complex than a simple Apache raid. The manner in which the bodies were found, when they were found, showed signs of injury patterns that are difficult to reconcile entirely with the standard tactics of Apache warfare in the period. More intriguingly, the few physical descriptions of the victims recorded by American military personnel who surveyed the area in the early 1850s mention skin conditions and physical abnormalities that are, again, difficult to explain through any conventional historical framework. The Peralta family had been mining the same formation that Jacob Waltz would later mine. They had been extracting the same ore, processing it with the same primitive techniques, handling it with the same complete ignorance of its invisible additional properties. The men who worked those mines for months or years at a time would have been experiencing the cumulative effects of radiation exposure, the fatigue, the cognitive impairment, the immune suppression that made them vulnerable to other illnesses, the skin lesions that come from contact with radioactive mineral dust. They were sick men before anyone attacked them. Their deaths in the mountains were the culmination of a process that had begun the first day they broke open a vein and breathed the dust of what they thought was simply gold-bearing rock. The story of Adolf Ruth is, in the annals of Superstition Mountain disappearances, the case that most clearly marks the transition from legend to documented historical tragedy. Ruth was 66 years old in June of 1931, a Washington, D.C. resident whose son, Erwin Ruth, had obtained what he claimed were original Peralta treasure maps through a Mexican land transaction in the 19-teens. Adolf Ruth had spent years studying those maps, corresponding with historians and prospectors, building what he believed was a definitive case for the location of the lost Dutchman mine. In June of 1931, despite his advanced age, despite a hip injury that limited his mobility, despite the fact that he would be travelling alone in one of the most unforgiving desert environments in North America, he went in. He arranged to be dropped at a ranch near the trailhead. He carried the Peralta maps, a compass, a canteen, supplies for several weeks. He wrote a cheerful letter to his son from the ranch, promising to wire once he had confirmed the mine's location. He walked into the mountains, and he did not come out. Search parties were organised in the summer and again in the fall, finding nothing. His remains were finally located in December of 1931, approximately half a mile from where he had last been seen, close enough to his entry point that the discovery raised immediate questions about how experienced searchers had failed to find him over the preceding months. What the searchers found was deeply strange. His skull had been separated from the rest of his skeleton, which itself was scattered over a considerable area, consistent with animal scavenging over the months of exposure. But the skull showed what multiple examiners described as 2 holes in the cranial bone, positioned in locations that some medical experts argued were consistent with bullet wounds. The debate over what killed Adolf Ruth consumed considerable attention in the Arizona press of the period, and it has never been fully resolved. The official conclusion was that he died of thirst and exposure, that the skull damage was caused by animal activity post-mortem, and that his scattered remains were simply the result of months of desert scavenging. This explanation is not impossible. It is also not entirely satisfying given the specific location and nature of the cranial damage. Near his remains, searchers found a note in his handwriting. It was water-damaged and partially illegible, but one phrase was clearly readable. and it has been quoted and analysed ever since. A reference to having found, or being close to, a vein of gold that matched the description in his Peralta maps. Whether this was triumphant discovery or exhausted delusion, the notation of a dying man whose dehydrated and radiation-compromised mind was generating visions of what he most wanted to find is impossible to determine. What is certain is that he died in those mountains, in a location that experienced search parties should have found months earlier, under circumstances that the official record refuses to fully explain. The year 1945 changed everything. Not just the course of the war, not just the geopolitical architecture of the 20th century, but the way that the United States government looked at its own geology. The Trinity test on July 16th, 1945, the first detonation of a nuclear device, inaugurated a new era of strategic resource anxiety. The Manhattan Project had consumed enormous quantities of uranium sourced primarily from the Belgian Congo and from Canadian deposits. As the Cold War took shape in the months and years following Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as it became clear that the Soviet Union was moving aggressively toward its own nuclear weapons capability, the United States government understood with urgent clarity that domestic uranium supply was a matter of national security. A nation that depended on foreign sources for the raw material of its most powerful weapons was a nation with a dangerous vulnerability. The United States Geological Survey, the Atomic Energy Commission, established by the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, and various military and intelligence adjacent agencies launched the most comprehensive mineral survey of the American West in the country's history. Survey teams fanned out across the Colorado Plateau, the Great Basin, the Sonoran Desert, the Rocky Mountain states. They were looking for uranium specifically, with the single-mindedness of a gold rush turned to national security purpose. They had aerial radiometric survey equipment. They had ground-penetrating analysis tools. They had for the first time a clear scientific understanding of what they were looking for and sophisticated methods for finding it. In the late 1940s, survey teams entered the Superstition Mountains. The specific reports generated by those surveys remain classified, not in the half-hearted, practically accessible way that many mid-century government documents are technically classified while being substantively available through FOIA requests, but classified in the harder, more deliberate way that suggests the information is still considered sensitive by someone with the authority to maintain that sensitivity. What can be inferred from public records, from the pattern of subsequent land use decisions, from the behaviour of federal agencies toward mining claims in the area, from the documented activities of the AEC in the region during this period, is that the surveys found something significant. Beginning in the late 1940s and accelerating through the 1950s, a series of administrative actions quietly reshaped the relationship between the federal government and the Superstition Mountains. Mining claims that had been filed and approved in previous decades were quietly denied renewal. Access roads that private parties had maintained were allowed to fall into disrepair without the usual federal maintenance assistance. Airspace above certain portions of the range was brought under monitoring protocols that were not publicly announced. The area was eventually incorporated into the Tonto National Forest and subsequently designated as wilderness, a designation that, while presented entirely in terms of environmental preservation, had the additional and considerably more significant practical effect of making the terrain legally inaccessible to any private mineral extraction operation. The official explanation was conservation. The American conservation movement was indeed gaining momentum in this period, and the Superstition Wilderness designation was publicly framed in entirely those terms. But the timing is instructive. The land use changes occurred precisely in the period when AEC survey activity in the region was at its most intense. The access restrictions were implemented in exactly the pattern you would expect if the government had identified specific zones of hazardous, radioactive material that it needed to contain. Not by cleanup, which was not yet technically feasible, but by exclusion, by keeping people out, by ensuring that no private mining operation would accidentally break open a uranium-bearing formation and scatter radioactive ore across the desert floor, or worse, begin extracting it for commercial purposes without the safety protocols that the AEC was simultaneously developing for its own controlled extraction operations. The Lost Dutchman mine, if the conspiracy framework is correct, was not lost at all. It was found, it was assessed, it was determined to be something that the federal government needed to control. And the most elegant, most historically resonant, most perfectly designed method of controlling access to it was the one that already existed, the legend itself. Herman Petrasch's story is less well known than Adolf Ruth's, which is itself less well known than Jacob Waltz's, which creates a kind of diminishing visibility as you move forward in time, each successive death slightly less documented, slightly more easily explained away, slightly less likely to accumulate the kind of public attention that demands answers. Herman Petrasch was an experienced prospector who had been searching for the Lost Dutchman mine since the 1910s, a man who had built up over decades a comprehensive knowledge of the Superstition Mountains and a collection of historical documentation about the mine that was, by the 1940s when he disappeared, among the most extensive private archives on the subject in existence. He had survived the mountains many times. He knew their moods, their water sources, their dangerous sections, the way the heat concentrated in certain drainages and made navigation treacherous in the afternoon hours. He was not a reckless man. He was methodical, careful, experienced. And then he went into the mountains in the mid-1940s and did not come back from a particular drainage on the western slope of the range. His field journals from the years preceding his death are a remarkable document. They describe, in the careful language of a man trained to observe and record geological information, a series of anomalies that he found in the area he was most focused on. He noted that certain sections of canyon wall felt warm to the touch even in cool weather, describing it as a heat that seemed to come from inside the rock rather than absorbed from sunlight. He described a persistent metallic taste in the mouth that he could not attribute to any food or water source. It came and went in specific locations, stronger in some canyons than others. Most significantly, he described a compass behaviour that he could not explain, a persistent deflection of his compass needle in a specific drainage that made accurate navigation impossible, and that he attempted to account for through various hypotheses, none of which satisfied him. His final journal entries, written from within the mountains on what turned out to be among his last expeditions, describe a fatigue and mental fogginess that he found alarming and unusual. Every one of those symptoms, the heat from rock formations, the metallic taste, the compass deflection, the cognitive impairment presenting as fatigue and mental fogginess, is consistent with proximity to high-grade uranium ore deposits. The heat is real. Radioactive decay generates thermal energy, and a sufficiently concentrated ore body will produce measurable localized warmth. The metallic taste is real. Ionizing radiation affects the mucous membranes and salivary chemistry in ways that create precisely this sensation. The compass deflection is real. Uranium ore bodies are frequently associated with ferrous mineral formations that create local magnetic anomalies. And the cognitive impairment is profoundly real. Acute radiation exposure attacks the nervous system, causing the exact symptoms Petrasch described: confusion, fatigue, difficulty with navigation and decision-making, before progressing to more severe physiological consequences. He did not know what was happening to him. No one knew. The biological effects of radiation exposure were understood in 1943 only in the most preliminary terms, and that understanding was itself among the most closely guarded secrets in the world, sequestered within the Manhattan Project's security apparatus. Herman Petrasch was being killed by something that his civilization had only recently identified and already classified. His body was recovered in rough terrain that his journals suggested he had successfully navigated many times before. The official record describes his death as the result of a fall and exposure. The unofficial record, his own handwriting in those final journal entries, describes a man whose cognitive faculties were progressively failing him in a specific geographic area in which he had previously been entirely competent. In 1958, according to documentation assembled by independent researchers from a combination of declassified USGS records, Freedom of Information Act requests, and the accounts of several retired federal employees who spoke on condition of anonymity in the 1990s, a classified geological survey operation was conducted in the Superstition Mountains. The operation has been identified in partial documents under a project designation that appears, in the fragments that have survived the declassification process, to reference both a geological assessment and a containment evaluation, a dual purpose that is itself revealing. You conduct a geological assessment when you're trying to understand what is in the ground. You conduct a containment evaluation when you have already determined that what is in the ground poses a hazard that needs to be managed. The survey mapped uranium density across the western and central portions of the range with a precision that previous aerial surveys had not achieved. It assessed the structural geology of the primary ore-bearing formations, the conditions under which the ore existed, the stability of the surrounding rock, the likelihood of surface exposure through erosion or seismic activity, and it evaluated the specific risk posed by treasure hunters and prospectors who were, throughout this period, continuing to enter the mountains in significant numbers, following the trails laid down by the Lost Dutchman legend, blundering, in the federal government's assessment, directly into areas of serious radiological hazard. The solution was both practical and aesthetically satisfying in its use of existing cultural material. The federal government did not need to actively propagate the Lost Dutchman legend. It was already propagating itself with remarkable effectiveness. Every new disappearance, every mysterious death, every expedition that returned with nothing but confused accounts of strange compass behaviour and inexplicable illness added another layer to the mythology. The legend kept people afraid, kept them uncertain, kept them from committing to the kind of systematic, well-resourced expedition that might actually make significant discoveries. And for those who pushed past the fear and went in anyway, the dedicated treasure hunters, the experienced prospectors, the men like Herman Petrasch, who had spent decades building the knowledge and confidence to penetrate the mountain's most dangerous zones, there were other mechanisms of discouragement available. The lights that people have reported seeing in the Superstition Mountains for well over a century are among the most Before we get into tonight's story, a huge thank you to some of the people who made this one happen. Sarah, Thomas, Stuart, Kristen, Dylan, Robert and Brian. You requested this, and honestly, it is one of the most fascinating rabbit holes we have gone down on this channel. Your curiosity drives everything we do here, and we are so grateful you are part of this community. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's talk about Project Sylvanus. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a forest just before something extraordinary happens. Hunters know it. Rangers know it. The logging crews who worked the Olympic Peninsula in the autumn of 1983 knew it in their bones long before they understood what it meant. It is a silence that is not the absence of sound so much as the withdrawal of it, as if every creature within a mile radius simultaneously decides that stillness is the only reasonable response to whatever has just entered their world. The birds stop calling. The insects halt their rhythmic scraping. The wind, even the wind, seems to reconsider. And then, in that hollow cathedral of quiet, something moves. The Olympic National Forest in Washington State is one of the last genuinely wild places in the contiguous United States. It encompasses nearly 1 million acres of old-growth temperate rainforest, alpine meadow, glacier, and coastline. The trees there are not merely large, they are ancient in a way that makes the word feel insufficient. Sitka spruce reaching 200 feet into the permanent overcast. Douglas fir with trunks wider than the span of 3 grown men with their arms extended. Mosses that have been growing on the same fallen log since before the Declaration of Independence was signed. This is a place that does not easily give up its secrets, and for most of recorded history it kept the greatest one of all without anyone being entirely certain there was a secret to keep. The logging crew operating in Grid Section 44 of the Olympic Peninsula that October was a team of 7 men contracted through a timber management company out of Aberdeen, Washington. Their work that week was routine: survey, mark, begin preliminary clearing on a stretch of secondary growth adjacent to a protected old-growth corridor. The morning of October the 12th, 1983, began like every other morning at that elevation in that season, cold, grey, saturated with the particular Pacific Northwest dampness that works its way through every layer of clothing regardless of quality. The crew chief, a man named Gerald Harwick who had worked this peninsula for 19 years, noted in his personal log that the fog that morning was unusually dense, sitting low between the trees and shifting curtains that reduced visibility to perhaps 30 or 40 feet in any direction. They heard it before they saw it. That much every man in the crew would later agree upon, though the circumstances under which they agreed were not public, and the people to whom they gave their accounts were not journalists or wildlife researchers. They heard a sound unlike anything they had encountered in a combined 112 years of outdoor labour. It was not precisely a vocalisation, not in the way a bear or elk vocalises. It was lower than that, and it carried a quality of resonance that seemed less like a sound passing through air and more like a vibration moving through the ground itself. Several of the men reported feeling it in their chests before their ears registered it. One described it later as similar to the lowest note a pipe organ could produce, felt rather than heard, emanating from somewhere ahead in the fog. Gerald Harwick was the first to see it clearly. He had moved perhaps 15 feet ahead of the rest of the crew to inspect a survey marker when the fog shifted and opened. For a period he estimated at between 4 and 6 seconds into something approaching visibility. What he saw standing at the tree line on the far side of a shallow drainage ditch was not a bear. He knew bears. He had encountered black bears and brown bears in these woods across nearly 2 decades of work. What he saw was bipedal. It stood on 2 legs with a stability and stillness that suggested it was not merely pausing from quadrupedal movement, but that 2 legs were its natural and practiced posture. His estimation of its height, given later under circumstances that required complete confidentiality, was between 9 and 9.5 feet. Its build was massive in a way that the word massive only approximates, dense through the chest and shoulders in a manner that suggested not fat but an extraordinary concentration of muscle beneath a coat of dark hair that was matted and thick across every visible surface of its body. It looked at him. He was certain of this. Whatever other uncertainties he carried about what he had seen that morning, the quality of being looked at was not among them. It regarded him for those 4 to 6 seconds with an attention that he described as evaluative, as if it were assessing something about him and finding the assessment conclusive. Then the fog closed again, and it was gone. Not running. Gone. The sound ceased. The birds did not immediately return. The crew spent the next 40 minutes in various states of shock and argument before Gerald Harwick made the decision to radio the nearest ranger station. The Wildlife Disturbance Report filed by Ranger Patricia Olson at the Olympic National Park Ranger Station later that afternoon was a document of careful professional restraint. She had spoken to the crew. She had observed that all 7 men corroborated the same basic facts. She noted the time, the location, the general description provided. Her training required her to log it as a wildlife sighting of undetermined species, and this is precisely what she did. what her training did not require, and what she did anyway because she was thorough and because something in the accounts of 7 experienced outdoorsmen unsettled her in a way she could not immediately articulate, was to notify the regional supervisor and request that someone with more wildlife expertise conduct a follow-up assessment. She did not expect what followed. Within 24 hours of filing her report, 3 unmarked helicopters, not Park Service, not Forest Service, not any agency she could identify by their markings, which were limited to numerical sequences she did not recognise, arrived at the ranger station. The men who disembarked were in civilian clothing but carried themselves with a posture and economy of movement that she recognised as military. They did not introduce themselves with full names. The man who spoke with her gave her a single surname, which she would later describe as possibly a pseudonym, and presented credentials from an office within the Department of the Interior that she had never heard of and which she subsequently could not locate in any official directory of federal agencies. The section of forest where the sighting had occurred was closed within 12 hours of the helicopter's arrival. The stated reason, communicated to the ranger station through official channels, was a wildfire containment precaution related to an electrical storm system moving through the region. There had been no electrical storm. Ranger Olson noted the discrepancy in a private journal she kept separate from her official records. She noted something else as well. The closure extended not just around the drainage ditch area where the sighting had occurred, but across a radius that she calculated at approximately 4 miles in each direction from that central point. This was not a wildfire precaution. This was a perimeter. What she could not have known, and what would not become even fragmentarily apparent for 2 decades, was that the perimeter existed because the men in the helicopters were not searching for something that might still be there. They already knew, from instrumentation she had no awareness of, precisely where it was and where it was going. The United States Geological Survey maintains a network of seismic monitoring stations throughout the Pacific Northwest, designed primarily for earthquake and volcanic activity detection. The stations are sensitive enough to register surface disturbances at remarkably fine scales. The data from 3 stations in the Olympic Peninsula region, covering the period from approximately 2 in the morning to 6:40 in the morning on October 12th, showed something that the standard analysis software flagged as anomalous, and referred to a human analyst who, in turn, referred it to a supervisor who, in turn, made a phone call to a number that did not appear in any standard directory. The seismic data showed a pattern of ground impacts consistent with bipedal locomotion. This in itself was not unusual. Humans move bipedally through forests all the time, and the sensors could register that. What distinguished these impacts was threefold. The weight distribution was substantially beyond the range consistent with human locomotion, falling instead in a range that the analyst's notes described as consistent with an erect primate of extraordinary mass. The stride symmetry was perfect in a way that was unusual even for trained human movement, a complete left-right regularity that bore no resemblance to the rolling, compensating gait of ursine movement, which was the only other candidate a standard analyst would have considered. And the pattern of movement extended across a 4-mile corridor that ended, as of the last registered impact, at a point deep enough in the old-growth forest that the analyst had flagged it as a dead end, a dense grove of old-growth fir with no obvious egress. The military convoy that arrived at the access road to grid section 44 at approximately 11:30 that night was not officially military, but the equipment they unloaded over the 1940s was not the same as the equipment they unloaded over the 1940s. But the equipment they unloaded over the course of the next 3 hours, and the efficiency and precision with which they deployed across a wilderness terrain in darkness, spoke to a level of operational planning and physical conditioning that bore no resemblance to any civilian agency. By dawn, whatever they had come to do was complete. The convoy departed. The perimeter remained. 2 weeks later, the wildfire containment closure was quietly lifted. No fire had occurred. No explanation was offered for the closure's removal. Ranger Olson's wildlife disturbance report was reclassified internally as a routine false alarm attributable to equipment misidentification by civilian contractors and removed from the active database. She kept her journal. She kept her doubts. She retired 8 years later without ever publicly discussing what she had observed in October of 1983. The document that would later become the central artifact of the entire Project Sylvanus archive was a 3-page internal memorandum generated on October 14, 1983, under the letterhead of an office within the Department of Defense whose full name was the Biological Anomaly Containment Initiative. The BACI was not a widely known program. Its existence, to the extent that it existed on paper at all, was buried within the administrative structure of a larger and more legitimate research division that dealt with agricultural and environmental biosecurity threats. This was by design. The BACI had been established in 1978, following a series of unexplained biological encounters in remote wilderness regions across the western United States. Encounters that were significant enough, in the assessment of certain analysts, to justify a standing response capability, but sensitive enough that no formal public acknowledgement was considered appropriate or desirable. The October 14th memorandum activated the BACI's highest operational tier. It designated the subject of the Olympic Peninsula incident as Specimen A. It outlined 3 immediate objectives in language that was clipped, technical, and entirely devoid of the kind of astonishment that a reader encountering it decades later might expect. The first objective was secure transport of Specimen A to a designated inland holding facility. The second was initiation of a full anatomical assessment protocol. The third was establishment of behavioural observation parameters to be conducted under controlled conditions. The memorandum described Specimen A in terms that read like a military equipment specification. Dense musculature, consistent with sustained load-bearing locomotion. Thick dermal tissue suggesting adaptation to environmental exposure. Vocalization range extending into infrasonic frequencies below the threshold of standard human hearing. Neural mass estimated via field assessment at substantially elevated levels relative to known great ape species. There was no wonder in the language. There was no awe. There was only the flat procedural certainty of a bureaucracy that had encountered something extraordinary and was determined to process it as efficiently as a requisition form. The holding facility to which Specimen A was transported was located in a remote stretch of northern Idaho that had been, in its public documentation, a forestry research outpost operated jointly by the Forest Service and a private environmental consulting firm. The consulting firm was a shell organisation. The Forest Service designation was genuine but hollow. The station appeared in agency records, received modest annual budget allocations that were never questioned, and generated quarterly reports that were competently fabricated by someone with enough familiarity with forestry research methodology to make them plausible. No actual forestry research had been conducted at the site since its construction in 1979. The facility itself descended through 7 sub-levels beneath a surface structure of convincing modesty. A cluster of wooden buildings indistinguishable from the kind of modest research station that dotted remote federal land across the region. Below the surface, the architecture was something else entirely. The first sub-level housed the administrative and communications infrastructure, server banks, radio equipment, a direct encrypted line to the Washington office that managed BACI operations, and dormitory quarters for the rotating staff of approximately 30 personnel. The second sub-level contained equipment storage, vehicle maintenance, and power generation systems. The third sub-level was where the observation chambers were located, a series of reinforced enclosures with one-way viewing panels, microphone arrays calibrated for both standard and infrasonic frequency ranges, and environmental controls capable of replicating a wide range of temperature, humidity, and light conditions. The fifth sub-level was the behavioural laboratory. This was where, over the course of the years that followed, researchers would conduct the experiments that would eventually shatter their professional frameworks and force a reclassification so significant that it generated an internal crisis that never reached the public. The 6th sublevel housed the genetic sequencing unit, which in 1983 was equipped with the most advanced DNA analysis technology available. Technology that was, even by the standards of that era, extraordinarily expensive and not widely accessible outside of the highest funded research institutions. The 7th sublevel was accessed by a single elevator that required 2 simultaneous key authorizations from personnel of senior classification, and its purpose and contents were known only to those whose names appeared on a list that was itself classified at a level requiring specific executive authorization to view. Specimen A arrived at the facility on October 17, 1983, transported in a custom-fabricated containment unit that the transport logs described only as Unit C7. The transport had required 4 vehicles, 3 escort personnel per vehicle, and had taken place entirely at night along routes that avoided all population centres. The subject had been sedated for transport. The sedation protocol itself had been a significant challenge, given that the standard dosages used for large primate sedation had proven, in field assessment, to be insufficient, and the team had been required to administer quantities that the medical officer noted in his log as being at the outer theoretical limit of what any known primate physiology could tolerate without fatal cardiac impact. Specimen A had tolerated them. The first week of observation established the baseline behavioural parameters that would govern the research programme for the next 4 years. Specimen A was contained in a chamber on the 3rd sublevel that measured 40 feet by 60 feet, larger than most residential homes, with a ceiling height of 20 feet. The floor was packed earth brought from the Olympic Peninsula. The walls were reinforced concrete faced with natural stone. Environmental controls maintained temperature and humidity conditions approximating those of the Pacific Northwest temperate rainforest. Food was provided according to a diet that field observation had suggested was consistent with known great ape dietary patterns, supplemented with proteins that the nutritional analysis team estimated were necessary to sustain the evident metabolic requirements of a subject of this size. Specimen A in those first days did not eat. This was documented without alarm in the early observation logs. The research team had anticipated an adjustment period, and the subject's apparent physical condition suggested it could sustain prolonged periods without nutritional intake, without immediate medical risk. What the early logs did document with careful attention was behaviour. Specimen A did not pace. It did not attack the walls. It did not display the stereotypic repetitive movements that are characteristic of stress responses in captive great apes. It sat. For the first 72 hours, with intervals of sleep that the observation team documented as occurring in 2 to 3 hour cycles, it sat in the approximate centre of the chamber and appeared to observe its environment with the same evaluative attention that Gerald Harwick had described in those 4 to 6 seconds of fog-cleared visibility in grid section 44. The DNA sequencing work that began in the 2nd week of November 1983 proceeded according to a protocol that the laboratory director, a man whose name appears in all surviving documentation only as Dr. M, had designed based on the best available analytical methodology of the period. The extraction of genetic material had required the participation of the facility's medical team and a sedation protocol that was by then somewhat more refined than the field procedure, though still operating at the outer limit of what was considered safe. The material extracted was sufficient for a comprehensive sequencing effort that, given the technology available, was expected to take several months. It took 4 months. The results, delivered to the Baki program director in late February of 1984, in a report that ran to 237 pages, were greeted with a response that the facility director later described in private correspondence as the most complete professional silence he had ever experienced in a career spanning 3 decades of classified research. The sequencing results showed that Specimen A's genetic material was 98% aligned with the human genome. This figure, which would have been extraordinary enough in isolation, was set against a baseline comparison. The chimpanzee genome shares approximately 98.7% alignment with the human genome. Specimen A was, genetically speaking, nearly as closely related to modern humans as our nearest confirmed evolutionary relatives. But the remaining 2% was where the results became something that no existing scientific framework could accommodate. The divergent genetic material did not align with any known primate species. It did not align with the genetic record of any hominin species in the paleontological database. It aligned, in partial segments, with genetic sequences that had been detected in trace amounts in certain human populations through studies that had not yet been widely published and whose implications the broader scientific community had not yet begun to grapple with. Dr. M's report concluded, with the kind of restraint that only someone who has been trained to deliver impossible information in controlled language could manage, that Specimen A represented a surviving member of an unknown hominid lineage that had diverged from the human ancestral branch approximately 200,000 years ago, and had subsequently evolved in parallel isolation from both modern humans and the known great ape lineage. The report recommended immediate reclassification of Project Sylvanus from a zoological anomaly containment operation to an anthropological research initiative of the highest priority. It noted with specific emphasis that the discovery raised questions of a legal, ethical and policy nature that exceeded the competency of the research team to assess and required consultation with expertise at levels not presently engaged with the project. It noted with specific emphasis that the subject's neural mass and the implications of the genetic data suggested cognitive capacities that had not yet been behaviourally confirmed, but that warranted serious investigation. It noted, with specific emphasis, that the current containment framework had been designed for a large animal and might require significant revision in light of what the genetic data implied. The program director's response to the report was to reclassify it at a higher clearance level and to schedule a review meeting with a small group of senior officials whose names did not appear in any publicly accessible government directory. Whether that meeting occurred and what conclusions it reached is not documented in any fragment that has subsequently come to light. What is documented is that the research program continued and that it expanded. By 1985, the behavioural laboratory on the 5th sublevel had become the centre of the facility's intellectual activity. The observation team had grown to include 2 linguists, a cognitive anthropologist, a behavioural neurologist, and 3 primatologists whose prior work had been focused on great ape language acquisition research. They had come to the facility through a process that involved, in each case, an initial approach by someone representing themselves as affiliated with a private research foundation, a series of increasingly specific conversations about their area of expertise, and ultimately a briefing that each of them would later describe, in whatever private accounting they made to themselves, as the most significant moment of their professional lives. None of them had been given a choice, exactly, but none of them had refused. The behavioural data accumulating in the observation records was building a picture that the team found simultaneously exhilarating and deeply unsettling. Specimen A had, by the spring of 1985, ceased the passive observation behaviour of the initial months and had begun engaging with its environment in ways that were impossible to attribute to instinct or conditioning alone. The subject had organised the elements of the chamber, the rocks, the branches, the soil, into patterns that recurred with sufficient consistency to suggest intentionality. The patterns were not random. They were not decorative in any way the researchers could immediately interpret. They were geometric in a basic sense, regular, repeated, internally consistent, and they changed over time in ways that suggested a developing system rather than a fixed one. The vocalization analysis had by this point consumed hundreds of hours of recorded material. Specimen A produced a range of sounds that extended from frequencies well within normal human hearing into the infrasonic range below 20 Hz, where human perception does not reach but instrumentation can. The higher frequency vocalizations showed patterns that the linguists had been analysing with growing intensity. There were recurring phonemic elements. There were structural regularities that bore a functional resemblance, at a very coarse level of analysis, to the structural regularities that linguists identify in human language. Whether this constituted language in any meaningful sense was a question the team argued about with a sustained passion that the observation logs captured only obliquely, in the form of meeting minutes that noted, with diplomatic understatement, ongoing discussion regarding the interpretation of vocalization data. What ended the argument, or at least transformed it into something different, was what happened in the spring of 1986. The observation team had begun, some months earlier, a protocol that involved playing recorded human speech to Specimen A through speakers mounted in the chamber. The protocol was not intended as a language training exercise. The team had been cautious about introducing that level of intentionality into the early behavioural work, but rather as an environmental enrichment measure, an attempt to provide sensory variety that might reduce whatever stress the subject was experiencing. The recordings were of ordinary conversation, read passages, lectures. They were played at moderate volume for several hours each day. In March of 1986, Specimen A began to respond. Not to the recordings themselves, not in the sense of attempting to communicate with the speakers, but in the dust of the chamber floor, which the research team had observed the subject occasionally marking with its fingers in ways that had previously seemed random, the new behaviour emerged. The subject was drawing, not pictures, nothing that could be interpreted as representational, symbols, specific, repeating forms that appeared, disappeared, were modified, and reappeared in a sequence that suggested a working process rather than a fixed product. The team photographed them systematically. The cognitive anthropologist spent 3 weeks developing a cataloguing system. The linguist noted structural resemblances to no known writing system, but also noted that the concept of symbolic marking for communicative purpose was exactly what this appeared to be. Then came the phonemic mimicry. It began subtly, a sequence of sounds in the subject's vocalization pattern that the audio analyst flagged as possibly containing elements borrowed from the recorded human speech. Then it became less subtle. Specimen A was reproducing phonemes from the recordings with a precision that the linguist found startling, given the anatomical differences between the subject's vocal apparatus and the human vocal apparatus. It was not reproduction that produced human-sounding speech. The resonance was wrong, the quality was fundamentally different, but it was reproduction that carried enough structural resemblance to be unmistakably intentional imitation. And then, in July of 1986, during a routine observation shift at approximately 3 in the morning when the chamber was lit only by the low-level maintenance lighting that approximated nocturnal conditions, the observation technician on duty heard the subject produce a sequence of sounds that she initially transcribed phonetically as something she could not identify. She played the recording back at half speed, then at quarter speed. Then she walked down the corridor to the linguist's dormitory and knocked on the door. The linguist listened to the recording 3 times. Then he sat in silence for a long time. What Specimen A had produced, at 3 in the morning in an underground chamber in northern Idaho, was a sequence of 3 phonemic clusters that bore unmistakable resemblance to 3 English words. We, still, here. The debate about whether this constituted language, whether it constituted communication, whether it constituted something that should change the entire ethical framework within which the project was operating, consumed the research team for the remaining months of 1986 and into the early weeks of 1987. The cognitive anthropologist argued that the distinction between instinctual mimicry and intentional communication was philosophically meaningful but practically difficult to establish with certainty. The behavioural neurologist argued that the neurological architecture suggested by the genetic data, the elevated neural mass, the cortical complexity that the medical team had estimated from external assessment, made intentional communication not merely possible but probable. The linguists argued that the structural characteristics of the symbol system and the phonemic sequencing together constituted a pattern of behaviour that, in any other context, they would not hesitate to characterise as language use. The programme director, who visited the facility in November of 1986 for the first time since the initial activation period, listened to all of these arguments in a series of briefings that lasted 2 days. He reviewed the observation logs, he viewed the recordings, he reviewed the genetic report. He requested a written summary from each team member of their professional assessment of the subject's cognitive status. He returned to Washington and filed a report that has never been made publicly available. What changed after that report was filed was operational rather than scientific. The observation protocols were tightened, access to the subject was restricted, and the team was informed that a formal review of the project's objectives was underway at the administrative level. On March 22, 1987, at 11:47 in the evening, the facility experienced a power failure. The backup generation system, which was designed to engage within 45 seconds of primary power interruption, did not engage. The security logs, which were recovered from a separate battery-maintained system, showed that the magnetic locking mechanisms on Specimen A's containment chamber disengaged during the power interruption and remained disengaged for 2 minutes and 41 seconds before the manual override system, which required physical activation by security personnel, was engaged. By that point, the chamber was empty. The subsequent search of the facility's interior found blood traces in the corridor outside the chamber. Not a large quantity. An initial analysis was unable to establish definitively whether it was the subject's blood or human blood, though the DNA analysis that was conducted in the days that followed established that it was human. 3 members of the security personnel were missing. Their names do not appear in any public record. They were never publicly reported as missing or deceased. The official account of events at the facility